I'll begin by saying once again, I want to thank Dave Whelan and the Talbot Spy for setting up this partnership with the Talbot County Free Library that allows me, the library guy, to talk to great local poets and writers. My guest today is Meredith Davies Hadaway, one of my personal favorites. She's the author of 3 books of poetry, At the Narrows, The River is a Reason, and one of my all-time favorite book titles, Fishing Secrets of the Dead, which gives me great pleasure to know that once I'm dead, I will be able to continue to fish. Her poetry is been called eco poetry. From my point of view, it's the life of the mind in the world of nature. And I'm going to read this next because her resume is so remarkable. I'm afraid I'll forget something. Meredith has received fellowships from the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, an individual artist award from the Maryland State Arts Council, multiple Pushcart nominations, I Hate You. Her collection, At the Narrows, won the 2015 Delmarva Book Prize for creative writing. In addition to publishing poetry and reviews in numerous literary journals, she served for 10 years as poetry editor for the Summerset Review. Hadaway holds an MFA in poetry from Vermont College of Fine Arts. She is a former Rose O'Neill writer-in-residence at Washington College, where she taught English and creative writing. Meredith, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Bill. It's a pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm actually from a military family. I was born in Naples, Italy, and we moved virtually every year of my life through childhood. So when I came to the Eastern Shore of Maryland in 1976 to spend the summer, I just fell in love with the place and realized that I had always wanted to have some roots. So that's how I came to be here, and this is the place that has very much been the inspiration for all my writing and my music and everything else that I've been involved with. Very much all creations of the Eastern Shore landscape.
You know, when I first started out as a writer for years, when anybody asked me what I did for a living, I was hesitant. I was afraid it sounded pretentious to say, "Oh, I'm a writer." At what point in your life did you find your skills had reached the level that you were confident enough to call yourself a poet?
I still think it sounds pretentious. And honestly, I don't really think of myself as a poet. I think of myself as a person who writes poetry. And that's fine with me.
A number of years ago, I was out kayaking on a hot summer day on Kings Creek here in Talbot County. And typical of an old guy, I got drowsy and I pulled over to the bank, climbed out of my kayak, lay down out in the middle of nowhere and fell asleep on my back. And I don't know how much later I began to wake up, and I got that uncanny feeling that something was looking at me, that someone was spying upon me. And so I popped my eyes open, looked out, and there in the middle of the river were these 2 heads protruding up above the water level, spying upon me like periscopes. And they were river otters, and they, just as soon as I opened my eyes, they went whoop, like that, right back down. I've never felt so completely watched in my life.
Wow.
I wonder if you'd begin by reading for us that great poem, River Otters.
I'd be happy to. I guess to set this up, I'll just mention that I've never seen these river otters, but since I moved here 40 years ago, people have always told me that there are river otters in the Upper Chester, which is where I live. And so I've been on this quest to see these darn otters. And so they've taken on a kind of mythic quality in my mind because they're elusive, they seem magical. And so that's, the basis for the poem is, where are these darn otters and what they've come to mean to me? River otters. Though I've never seen them, please let them be here. Small gods of happiness that somersault through the river's upper reach. I want to hear them chuckle and romp. I want to see them float backward, fish flopped across bellies, fur ruffed at their throats. Let there be breakfast for otters and naps in the sun. Let them wheel in the current, pumping webbed toes. Let them slap at the tides as they tumble. Let them hide when I churn my boat upriver. Enough to imagine them, holding their breath beneath the large, sad surface when my shadow passes.
Otters are my wife's totem animal, and from time to time I still read that poem to her. She loves it. It's great.
Well, full disclosure, Bill.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that I read this once, and there was a woman in the room who was a marine biologist who told me that river otters do not float backwards and eat fish off their bellies. Only sea otters do that. So that's one discrepancy. However, these are imaginary otters in my poem, so it's okay. And then I recently learned that from a friend that was kayaking up on the chop, or down from here on the chop tank, was bitten by a river otter. So, twice. So I'm just telling you, if you should see these small gods of happiness, you might want to paddle in the other direction.
Was this Dave Harp?
I don't know who was bit. It was
Okay.
Bill Thompson who told me the story.
Yeah,
but
I think it's Dave Harp. I've heard that tale, and it was remarkable. You should hear the rest of it, but we'll go on.
Okay.
As a poet of nature, how do you respond? How does your poetic muse respond right now to the fact that, in a very real sense, it's nature that's attacking us with this pandemic?
Well, my feeling about nature attacking is that if the pandemic is an attack, it's self-defense. We certainly have it coming. However, not to in any way belittle the gravity of this circumstance where we find ourselves. And, I feel about it the same way I feel about hurricanes and other inevitabilities. The real question is, how do we respond? And I think that despite the enormous tragedy and loss, the fact that we have come together in really remarkable ways reinforces my view that when it's poetry, the arts, anything to do with humanity, it's all connection. And the fact that we've been able to rise to the occasion, at least so far, we'll see where it goes, but it certainly has underscored our need to look at the entire natural world, including the human world, as one connected ecosystem.
Yes, and I think that connectedness, that need we have for each other, is part of our nature. So
Absolutely.
yeah. In an interview that Ann Caldwell did with you for the Delmarva Review, you said something that caught my eye. You said that teaching, and then here I quote, "Teaching remains the most revelatory and rewarding aspect of my life as a poet." Well, that's striking. Can you expand upon that a little bit?
I think teaching is, again, it's that connectivity. And for me, teaching is core to the whole idea of poetry as a shared experience. I mean, it's a participatory art. And it requires not just a writer, but a reader, listeners. And what I find every time I've taught, and I have taught in the public schools, I've taught young children, I've taught high school kids, I've taught Washington College students, and currently teach adult poetry workshop. And I learn so much when I teach, and it keeps my passion for poetry alive. And I feel that it's transformational in a way that goes both ways, which is just a rare and wonderful opportunity.
Have you always loved language?
Absolutely. I attribute it to the fact that I was born in Italy, where I heard multiple tongues from the get-go, including not just Italian and obviously English, but Neapolitan, which is a wonderful dialect that's a mashup of about 3 other languages. So I've, from the get-go, I've been very, very driven by the desire to make things out of language.
You speak Italian?
A little bit, and studied French for many, many years, but I'm pretty rusty on both, and I don't know when I'll get back to the homeland. So for now, I just go to Louisa's and talk to Michael at the bar.
Mais oui, moi je parle français comme une vache espagnole.
Comme une vache espagnole, moi aussi.
I speak French like a Spanish cow. How about music? I've always thought that one of the reasons I'm so dreadful when it comes to writing verse is that I've got 2 left feet. How about you?
Well, it could be. I've been involved with music. My dad taught me to read notes right around the same time I was learning to read words. And so they've always been intertwined. My mother was a great lover of poetry and had us reading poems as small kids. My dad was teaching me, how to play with two fingers on the piano keys. And so I can't really separate them in my mind. Obviously, music informs poetry. And for me, most of the poems come to me first as a rhythm and maybe a bass line. And before I even know what the words are, I can feel, this rhythm.
Neat. That's really neat. I'm absolutely lost with any kind of rhythm, so, as my wife will attest, as will her feet. Um, as the library guy, I'm always promoting poetry. I love poetry, and it saddens me that so few people, it seems today, read poetry. Although I think it's better than it once was. And a lot of people, when I approach them on the subject, say, "Well, I love prose, but poetry, I try to read it and I don't understand it, and it makes me feel stupid." And I have to admit, sometimes when I'm reading a poem in the New Yorker, I find myself feeling pretty stupid too. What do you say to people who say that to you? How do you respond to that charge?
I hear that a lot, and especially about the New Yorker. And the funny thing is, when you read an article in the New Yorker that you don't agree with, or you don't understand, or it's boring, you never say, "I hate prose." So why are we holding poetry to the standard of the New Yorker? Not that there aren't some wonderful poems in the New Yorker, but there's poetry to be found everywhere. I have to remind people, Shakespeare, that's all written in poetry. The Bible, that's all written in poetry. Poetry takes so many different forms, and when people tell me they don't like poetry, what I hear is, you don't read poetry. Because if you're really reading poetry, it will speak to you. Not necessarily all the poetry that's out there, but you'll find the poem you need when you need it. And so I'm not too concerned. Poetry has been with us, since it was around a campfire at night in a pre-literate society. It's totally core. It's as core to our humanity as music is. So it's not going away. And when we need it, we find it. And in the meantime, I applaud you, because I know you've been a great champion for bringing poetry to people through the library, through readings. And, it's very rare for someone to come to a reading and not walk away from it appreciating poetry. And I'm always flattered when people say to me, I really didn't think I liked poetry, and I hear this at a reading. I really don't like poetry, but I like what you did.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
Okay.
It's a great first step, and you're I think a terrific poet to begin with too, and perhaps end with. Speaking of ending, I'm afraid we have to move in that direction.
Sure.
And I'd like to finish with one of my favorite poems of yours, which combines poetry and music. I think, "Heron and Harp." Would you read that for us?
Sure. Just to set it up, I do play the harp, and I'm in a little trio, sometimes larger group, called Harp and Soul. And we were getting ready to do a gig and needed a photo. So I took my harp down to the end of my dock, because we decided we wanted to be surrounded by water. And I was waiting there for everybody else, including the photographer, to show up. And that's just sort of the context for the poem. But anyway, it's a true story. Heron and Harp. I drag my harp across the gapped terrain of pier, 100 feet with nothing underfoot but slats of air and swirling tide, and place the harp in front of me to play "The Water is Wide," a sort of joke here where the channel is so narrow. A few notes into the song, a squawk. Flying low, a heron glides across the river's edge to land beside me, head tucked so he can stare me down from his perch on a piling, summoned by the strange cascade of frequencies. Or did he mistake the arching frame for another large and gawky bird? I keep the tune going, a slow air, we would call it, as the oscillations rise and then retreat, leaving song and bird, the harp, and me, suspended in a pulse, a wave, a measure, where the water is wide enough to hold us all.
Wow. Thank you. That's beautiful. Meredith Davies Hadaway, thank you so much for being with us today. And you got to promise me you will never, ever quit writing, okay?
That's a promise. Thank you so much, Bill. I really...